Okay guys, welcome back to our Ancient Egypt series. This week we're going to be covering the Nile, a river that's not only incredibly important to Egypt today, but was also incredibly important to the ancient Egyptians, and is incredibly important to us because it's the basis of our assessment for this term, something you guys are going to be learning a bit more about over the next few weeks. Without further ado, let's delve into the Nile. Okay, firstly, let's start with a prayer. Homage to thee, O Hapi, thou appearest in this land, and thou comest in peace to make Egypt to live. Thou art the hidden one, and the guide of the darkness on the day when it is thy pleasure to lead the same. Thou art the waterer of the fields which Ra has created. Thou givest life unto all animals, thou makest all the land to drink unceasingly, as thou descendest on thy way from heaven. That's an Egyptian prayer to the god of the Nile, Hapi. In that one sentence, it should give you a real sense of just how important this river was to the ancient Egyptians. Because you've got this notion that the river was a god in and of itself. So important to constitute a god. It might not look like a god to you guys, and it might not look like a god to me, but to the ancient Egyptians, it represented everything. It represented life, it represented death, and everything in between. And for that reason, today we're going to delve into some of the reasons why and how they impacted ancient Egyptian society. So let's go through some of the basics. Some of this is retread from the introduction video, but some of it will be quite new. So here on the right-hand side, you got a couple of different maps of the Nile. You see on the leftmost map that it starts quite far south near Uganda, around Lake Victoria, and then flows up gradually through Ethiopia, the Central African Republic, Sudan, parts of Eritrea, and then of course into today's Egypt, which was also ancient Egypt. On the rightmost map, you see the actual map of ancient Egypt with some of the key landmarks. So you see where the major cities are, places like Luxor, Thebes, places like Heliopolis, Memphis, and of course Cairo. So the Nile itself, about 6,500 kilometers long. The longest river in the world, by far. Incredibly important to a lot of nations along the way of its flow because of the water it carries and the life-giving ability to basically grow crops that provides. Its water discharge is about 1,800 to 2,800 meters cubed per second. Around the Aswan Dam, it's about 2,800 meters cubed per second. If you want to picture that, picture a box where each side of the box is a meter long, and you fill that box with water. That's a meter cubed of water. Okay? The average depth of the river is between 8 and 11 meters, so pretty deep, all things considered. But compared to a lot of other rivers, it actually doesn't carry all that much water. Like if you were to compare it to the river that flows through the Congo, for example, it carries about 5% of the water of that river, which is crazy, but true. It's not so much the amount of water, it's what it brings with it, as you guys will come to see over the next few slides. So, in terms of thinking about its impact on ancient Egypt, well, if we go back to the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote history thousands of years ago, he actually refers to it, the country, Egypt, ancient Egypt, as the gift of the Nile. Because without the Nile, ancient Egypt would not have been possible. There would have been no way for that society to grow, to survive, to thrive. It would have basically died in its infancy. So to Herodotus, the ancient Egyptians were basically the gift of the Nile. Now the Nile, and the reason why the ancient Egyptians were the gift of the Nile was because it was the basis of all farming. Everything that was farmed in ancient Egypt happened along the river Nile. So wheat, flax, papyrus, everything the ancient Egyptians grew or domesticated, they did so along the river. And this goes so far as to basically impact the Egyptian calendar, which was actually based around the Nile. So 3 different seasons, Akhet, Peret, and Shemu, each about 4 months long. And we'll talk about those more in a second. But before we do, and as we do, let's go through some other definitions so that we start to understand some of the terms that are going to be used, some of the ways of actually accessing this information. So firstly, what is agriculture? the thing that we've been talking about, farming, the fancier word for it. It's the practice of farming crops and other domesticated food sources. And it's something that you guys should learn how to use, especially when you get around to doing your essay writing over the next few weeks. Inundation is this annual predictable flooding of the Nile, which means every year the river floods at pretty much the same time and mostly at the same level. So its predictability and the fact that it happens that regularly is incredibly important to a successful society that depended on it. Silt. Now this is the soil that the Nile actually delivers and deposits on the riverbanks when it floods. So it's not so much the water itself, which is important. It is, but the silt is what makes it possible to farm crops in the way they were farmed in Egypt. So basically mud, really nutrient-rich mud that's great for plants to grow in, and that ends up on the banks of the river during flooding. Akhet, Peret, and Shemu, the planting, growing, and harvest season respectively. So Akhet was the season of planting, Peret growing, and Shemu harvest. And obviously Akhet was also the season of inundation when the river would flood, allowing for the planting of crops. A shaduf was a device used to move water from its source to an irrigation canal or farm. And you guys will see what that looks like in a second. But basically, it's one of the tools that the ancient Egyptians used to make farming possible along the river. And of course, irrigation is the supply of water to help grow crops, usually through canals. So basically, the water you put, or the water you get to farms so the crops can grow, that's called irrigation. And it's incredibly important to farming. Okay, so let's talk about farming along the Nile. Here we have papyrus, a plant that basically transforms into the earliest form of paper, as you can see here on the right-hand side with the writing. Papyrus was first farmed by the ancient Egyptians, and they used it basically to do exactly that, be able to write using hieroglyphics on the surface that you can create using the plant. So turning the papyrus reed into actual papyrus. It made Egyptian society quite advanced because a lot of the other societies around the time would write on stone tablets as opposed to this much more flexible, much more available material that was grown. Then we have, of course, wheat, and we should be pretty familiar with that. Wheat basically transforms into bread once it's been processed, once it's been cooked. And it is obviously incredibly important as a food supply. And then, of course, you get this thing, flax. And flax you can basically create linen out of. Linen was used by the ancient Egyptians for clothing. So the ability to grow the stuff they needed to make their clothes out of had a big impact on their society. And of course, there were some animals too involved in this farming. Like here you have the water buffalo, which was not only used for meat, definitely it was butchered for meat, but it was also used as a farm animal that could drag things and push things, which was really important to farming as well. And then, of course, the fish. And fish was a staple diet. This is a perch fish, I believe, which was a real staple food for a lot of poorer Egyptians. Wealthier Egyptians didn't really eat fish. They thought it was impure for a number of different reasons. But basically, one of the most important foods for poorer ancient Egyptians. So, what are we talking about when we talk about irrigation? Well, we're talking about irrigation canals. And the ancient Egyptians farmed primarily by being able to move water from the Nile to their farms. And they did so using these canals. They also used something called a shaduf, which basically was made to transfer water. So you could get it from a canal to where it's needed, like your crops. In that way, you can make sure that they're watered, that they have the nutrients they need, and they can grow so they can be harvested during Shemu. However, of course, farming wasn't the only impact the Nile had on Egyptian society. Let's have a look at the words of McJewett, a historian who wrote a book called Hapi. The Egyptians had no clue how or why the Nile flooded each year. They believed that the gods Khnum, Satet, and Ankhet were the guardians of the source of the Nile. Their duty was to make sure that the right amount of silt was released during the yearly inundation. Hapi was in charge of the waters that flowed during the floods. The flood was commonly known as the arrival of Hapi. And the thing that McDewitt doesn't mention there is, of course, that over time, the role of the pharaoh in this was to basically make sure that Hapi was happy and that Hapi would bring enough water to sustain Egypt. So the pharaoh had this really important role in these ceremonies that were supposed to make Hapi happier. They would do things like they would throw amulets into the water, make offerings to Hapi to make sure that Hapi was pleased. And of course, when that didn't happen, in terms of Hapi bringing enough water, what was the impact of a bad flood? Well, a bad flood for Egypt was absolute catastrophe. If the river did not flood in its regular, in its predictable way, we were talking about massive starvation. And that's actually one of the things that destroys the old kingdom of ancient Egypt. Historians have looked at it over time and have found that there were probably a number of bad floods during that time. And that led to a social breakdown, that led to violence, that led to a lot of unrest and a lot of population loss because people would starve to death where the Nile didn't run well anymore. So an incredibly important water source, an incredibly important food source. Without the Nile, there was no ancient Egypt. And that's something you guys are going to have to get to grips with. You're going to have to do a little bit of research on your own, because soon enough you'll be writing essays, or an essay each, about why the Nile was so important to the ancient Egyptians. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, and catch you again soon.